discuss apartments and duplex defects.
Thanks very much, Las Karen Corla. So it's now almost a year since the government received this report of the working group to examine defects in housing. And what is laid out in this report is quite a shocking tale of builders cutting corners through loopholes that were inserted by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in terms of self-certification for builders and devastating consequences for apartment and duplex owners. Suggests that a majority of apartments and duplexes built between 1991 and 2013 are affected by defects, between 50 and 80%. It's an incredible figure, amounting to between 62,500 and 100,000 apartments or duplexes, affected by a range of defects, but mostly fire defects, facing an average bill to fix each apartment or duplex of €25,000. I have no doubt that that figure is going to increase rather than decrease over time. Thanks to the campaigning of residents from across the country coming together in the Not Our Fault campaign, thanks to the lobbying of the Construction Defects Alliance, then at the start of this year the government promised a 100% redress scheme, including retrospection, which is obviously extremely welcome. However, the devil was then and is now in the detail. I mean, the government claims to have a 100% redress scheme in place for the people affected by mica, but if you talk to the people affected by mica, they definitely do not agree that that's what is happening and are completely unsatisfied. So I have a number of specific questions. One is about time frame. Like, the whole thing seems to be happening extremely slow. So there is the leak of a report of an advisory group to develop a code of practice in the Irish Times on Monday, and that suggests, and it's reflected in a paper by the Construction Defects Alliance, that suggests that the timeframe the government is looking at is heads of bill developed by the end of the year and hopefully a scheme in place by autumn 2024. It seems to be extraordinarily slow. We've known this issue has existed for years. We've had the details since July of last year, and obviously the timeframe of autumn 2024, if that slips, well, then we're going beyond probably the time frame of the next general election. So a question about time frame. Secondly, a question about retrospection. Again, hints in the Irish Times of resistance from inside the department to retrospection, the idea that people who have already paid out to fix their apartments or duplexes, that there's a resistance to the idea that that needs to be paid by the state, which it absolutely does. I think the state should then pursue the builders who are responsible. Third issue, which I think is the crucial issue, is the issue of emergency funding. So at the time, in January, the Minister would have spoken about the possibility of emergency funding. They were looking into it and so on. There's a reference now to interim funding in the report from the Irish Times. This needs to happen, and it needs to happen before the end of the year. You look at the fire that happened in Blanchardstown a couple of weeks ago. Fires can and will happen in multi-unit developments. And if you have, we know a majority between 1991 and 2013, if you have fire defects in place, those fires can spread extremely quickly, and it would be grossly negligent by the government not to have emergency funding in place, to put in place the necessary measures, bearing in mind that a majority of people living in these places don't even know that they're affected. And fourthly and finally, the Minister at the time spoke about speaking to the insurance companies to deal with the issue of apartment owners management companies finding it difficult to get insurance. It's not clear if there's any progress on that.
Thank you, Lasky Hirlock. I'm taking this matter on behalf of my colleague Darragh O'Brien, TD, Minister for Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and I wish to thank the Deputy for raising this issue and for providing us with an opportunity to update the House on this important matter. At the outset, I would like to assure the House of this Government's commitment to support homeowners and residents of many apartments and duplexes that have defects. I fully acknowledge the stress that this causes when defects arise in relation to the buildings and their homes that they live in. Since the receipt of the Government approval in January of this year to draft legislation to support the recommendations of defects, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage has been working to progress the various programmes of work that are required to place the remediation scheme on a statutory footing And I think the Deputy will appreciate that does take some time to get a scheme like this completed on a statutory footing through the Houses. A key aspect of this work is developing a code of practice in the context of the Fire Services Act to provide guidance to relevant professionals, including guidance on interim safety measures. The development of this code of practice was a key recommendation of the working group that Minister O'Brien established to examine defects in housing. The group working on this code includes industry professionals, local authority fire services, the Housing Agency and the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. The work of this group is nearing completion and the Department expects to be in a position to publish this code of practice for public consultation in the coming weeks. The code of practice will be a key feature on which operations of the statutory scheme will be based. It will support the development of a reasonable and practical approach to resolving fire safety defects and to ensure a consistent approach nationwide to remediation. While the Code of Practice will apply to the remediation of fire safety defects, it could be built upon in regard to the remediation of structural and water ingress defects in due course. So the Deputy can see the priority in terms of fire safety, and then the issue of remediation of structural and water ingress defects can be looked at subsequently to dealing with the fire issue. And I know the Deputy did highlight the fire in Blanchardstown recently, and I think everybody would accept we have to deal with that as an immediate early starter as part of this process. The scheme will be administered by the Housing Agency on a nationwide basis, and interaction and interdependency with the local authority fire services and others will need to be considered, with the remediation of fire safety defects carried out to the satisfaction of the local authority fire services. An advice and information service and portal within the Housing Agency is in the process of being established. In addition, work is also underway to draft the required legislation, which will include the scope, eligibility and conditions of the remediation scheme. While the Department is working on the development of the scheme as a matter of priority, sufficient time is required to draft the legislation to ensure that the scheme is fit for purpose, provides value for the taxpayers' money and contains appropriate oversight and governance measures. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Corla. I appreciate that the Minister isn't Minister O'Brien. You say the opportunity to update the House on this important matter, but you didn't really provide that much update apart from the fact, which we know from the Irish Times, that this code of practice is being developed, that was referred to previously in the Dáil. But something worrying is that it says the code of practice including guidance on interim safety measures. That would obviously be welcome. We need guidance on interim safety measures, but to make these interim safety measures happen, we need money. We need funding, because that's at the bottom line of this issue, is that people cannot afford to pay €20,000 or whatever to make their homes safe. None of this is these people's fault. They're not responsible for it, and they don't have the money to pay for it. And so if we identify that there is a serious fire risk in our apartments in terms of the threat of fire spreading rapidly, well, then we have to provide funding urgently to ensure that the work is done to make it safe on an interim basis while the full scheme is rolled out. I think that is essential, and again, it would be grossly negligent of the government not to take that action given the information that it has in front of it. I didn't get an answer, but maybe the Minister O'Brien will provide an answer in terms of the other issues of retrospection, of the issue of insurance, and then in terms of the timeframe, again, I just would stress the urgency on all of this. I would encourage the Minister or any member of the House to come out and meet the campaigners, people who are living in these conditions, who face, who in the light of the fire in Blanchardstown are thinking more about these safety issues. They're outside the Dáil every Wednesday from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. Next week, the Not Our Fault campaign is planning a 24-hour protest, so if people are free at any stage in the day, they can go out and talk to these people and get a sense of the urgency, in particular for the emergency funding or interim funding, whatever you want to call it, but it needs to have money involved to ensure that this work happens before the end of the year.
Again, I want to thank the Deputy for highlighting this issue, and it's an important issue for allowing me again to assure the House of this Government's commitment to deal with the issue of defects in apartments and to assist homeowners who find themselves in a difficult financial position. And I fully appreciated that affected homeowners want a remediation scheme to be established immediately, and assure the Government shares this ambition. But I did mention there will have to be legislation, and hopefully that will get a good passage through the House once that's put in place. In the meantime, it's important that the owner and management companies do not pause the undertaking of important life safety work. For this reason, the Government has agreed that remediation works related to fire safety defects entered into or commenced from the 18th of January 2023 will form part of the remediation scheme, subject to the proper terms and conditions. The details of this process are being worked out as a priority in parallel to the Code of Practice. So that's dealing with fire safety defects where work was entered into or commenced from the 18th of January this year. So that's an element of retrospection. As the works continue, Minister O'Brien looks forward to continuing engagement with key stakeholders and encourage all interested parties to participate in the public consultation on the Code of Practice when it is launched in the coming weeks, primarily in the first instance dealing with the fire safety issue. The Code of Practice will provide for a system of certification whereby fire safety recommendation works and remediation works, when completed in accordance with the provisions of the Code and signed by the competent building professional and competent builder, will demonstrate that the defects discovered have been satisfactorily remediated. And this will be a benefit to all stakeholders. And as I did mention earlier, the local authority fire certification will be required as well. I will speak directly to the Minister. You mentioned the timetable. There are some dates I'm able to give you. I deal with an element of retrospection. I'm sure not to everybody's satisfaction, but there is an element of retrospection in relation to work commenced since earlier this year, and then the issue of funding, especially for the fireworks. I'm sure that will be dealt with once this document is published. And the issue of the management companies and the insurance, I will bring these to the Minister's attention later on today. Thank you.
Now,